Hey,
Mr. Steve.
and Mr. Chief, or Chief Mister.
Yeah, it's wonderful to meet you in Nairobi.
Yes, imagine.
Yes.
It's a very strange encounter coming together, isn't it?
It's wonderful.
A crossing of paths in different continents and common interests, but no doubt different perspectives too.
You know, this is what we talk about, that there's the family which you're born into, and there's the family that you find as you travel and as you go to new places. You discover all these connections which were invisible before.
Whenever I attend networking groups, people always say, "So why are you here?" I say, "Random encounters is what works for me," and I suspect we're going to have some interesting verbal encounters over the next few minutes or so.
I think a good place to go in is how I first encountered you without ever meeting you. And that was by reading your book last night.
Oh, okay.
You made for a very interesting evening with my wife, which would have just been chores otherwise. And we spent about a good 2 hours going into it. And it's a really concise book, about 130 pages, which is the same length as my book. And what was really surprising was the information that you put in there. It was so matter of fact that we're actually living through our own extinction. And I had this image of a really despairing man who's, just ready to throw in the towel, and then I meet you and you're smiling. And, so,
well, it's not every lifetime that gets to live through an extinction or existential threat to humanity as we have right now, but we'll come back to that.
A really interesting place I think we could go in is something which I found we share as I was reading your book. You start by explaining your context, how you grew up in the birthplace of this, the creation of this global machine that we are now living in, that's just farting exhaust fumes, And it was your village that kicked it off, and this was like a sense of responsibility that you had, that as a fruit, as a son of this place, I must do something to undo this.
Well, it looks like we have our authoring and publishing in common, and that's definitely one thing. But as a non-fiction writer, I never thought of myself as a storyteller, but I will tell you that little story because it's very relevant. I mean, I come from the UK, and before I came to Africa, which is a long time ago now, I had the opportunity and in retrospect the great honor of setting up one of the first national recycling programs called Bottle Bank, so recycling glass back in the day. So I came to a point in my career where I'd achieved something very tangible, and at that point I didn't know what to do, so I came to Africa, which is something else entirely. And it's only more recently that I found myself back in the UK, and as I was sitting at my study window looking out over the river, trying to think, well, how do I bring this climate change research that I've been working on to something that I can publish and people might be interested in. I had a falling of the scales from the eyes. I overlooked the River Derwent in the northern part of Derbyshire, which is right in the heart of one of Britain's oldest national parks called the Peak District National Park. There's all moorlands and sheep farms. And I suddenly thought, compared with my experience in Africa, all we have in the UK is what I call a sheep migration. We don't have migrations, we just have sheep.
Yeah.
This is not natural environment, it's farmland and moorland.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then just downstream, in fact, right within my eye line where I was writing, is a mill dating back to about the late 1700s. And it suddenly dawned on me that, oh my gosh, this is where the Industrial Revolution actually kicked off. A chap called Richard Arkwright built a mill powered by the water and water mills to process cotton into fabrics. Very soon after that, the steam engine was invented with local coal mined out of the ground, and the fossil fuel burning, exhaust emitting Industrial Revolution started right there where I was writing. And I suddenly felt this crushing sense of responsibility that it happened in Britain, in the heart of what is now beautiful countryside, just at the moment that the British colonists were venturing around the world, exporting this new know-how around the world. And that kicked off industrialization, consumer society, that now everybody in places, even including in Kenya, wants to emulate.
And their colonial ambitions were powered by this combustion engine.
Powered by it in a military sense as much as anything else. Steamships took over from sailing ships and enabled that growth around the world. So British industrialization, if it hadn't been British, I'm sure it would have been German or American, but it just happened that way, found its way to Africa, to Australia, to China, to North America, eventually to South America. And for the last generation or two, we've had such an amazing existence based on the growth that took off from that. And now suddenly we
fresh
realize
vegetables from across the world.
Fresh vegetables, holidays in Fiji and Japan, commuting across the world, everything that goes with that consumer society. And guess what? That is exactly what is now messing up our planet.
And now we are asked to give up this imperial lifestyle. And I mean this imperial as in terms of, even for a middle income person living in 2019, they can enjoy the luxuries that only emperors could be able to afford before having food come in from all around the world on your table. You know, having the best of the world's entertainment just plugged in. You're asking us to give this up.
And the scary message is this is the wrong thing to be doing.
Yes.
It is not only not natural, it is dangerous both to the planet and to our own existence. Now, this is why I'm totally intrigued by your unlearning principle. So you better rewind that for me.
My own sense of responsibility comes from the fact that in my own family tree, my great-grandfather, who was born sometime in the 19th century, he was one of the early adopters of the Christian religion and became a big missionary for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which really took hold in Kisii, where your wife is from also. And I've always pondered, because his life was a really intriguing one, but his fate was completely different from his brother, who completely rejected this new theology. He saw it as an abandonment of, if you read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you'll have a pretty good picture of what my family 4 generations back was. And his brother, who rejected the faith, suffered a very terrible fate. He was exiled by the administration. This was a colonial administration. He was exiled to Kismayu in Somalia, where he died. His family never heard from him again. And they struggled generations down. But the brother who adopted the new software, people only look at it only as religious, but the thing that they failed was that it was a package. There was an educational program that you swallowed with this. There was a consumption program. They wore the suits, the neckties. And they got the what you could call maybe the rewards of that. But now, 4 generations later, I'm in exactly the same position of realizing that this is actually a suicidal program. This is a gun pointed at our own ecology. And how do you turn around using a paddling stick? How do you turn around this huge aircraft carrier? And for us, I feel it's much more a social program, because in terms of per capita, our CO2 emissions aren't at the same levels as say, much Indonesia or a much more industrialized country. For us, our issues are more urbanization, clearing natural ecosystems and replacing on them concrete, things like this. And that's more like, that's a cultural program. How, if you look at even the architecture of our city right now in Nairobi, despite the fact that the majority of citizens use their legs and bicycles, it's very clear that the architects of the city prioritized motorized transport, and that's an ideological thing. It's an ideology that says that we don't value pedestrians, we don't value people who do not have enough money to spend on a car. And so the work that I've tried to do with the book is understanding the science, but how people are going to experience the science is through this ideological change, because it has to happen with you as an individual. I find that the challenge with climate change is that it's so non-intuitive, grasping. It's so fascinating. Like that's one of the reasons why I was really looking forward to meeting you, is that it's not intuitive for us to think globally and globally and exponentially, to be able to see on timescales beyond our own life.
It's even worse, I suspect, than you're suggesting. And I think you're at the heart of unlearning. Just might be the glimmers of a solution. Let me give you for example. When human beings go out and look at an environment, let's say a rainforest, and in the west of Kenya you see plenty of examples. You can go onto Google Earth and you can zoom down and see what used to be rainforest is now tea estates. What used to be rainforest is now subdivided farmlands. And the rainforest has been shrinking, and the lack of it affects the climate for the rest of the country. So the new farmlands get less rain. The tea estates have come up and down because their climate is less predictable than it was. And yet, in terms of the development of the economy in the country, tea estates are considered to be a fantastically valuable thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And climatically, they're not. They're a disaster.
Yeah.
From the point of view of family development, I'm sure the family you've described all own farms and small holdings. And everybody would think that's an absolutely natural, correct thing to do. But in the long run, it doesn't work because they won't be able to grow anything.
I saw, I mean, like, I think in my dad's case, he always tried to grow an arboretum along the path of the river. And he was very green in terms of like making sure that there were trees on every terrace. Like we didn't have the vocabulary to describe permaculture, but that's actually what he was doing. He was doing permaculture. But it's a very interesting the shift that you're describing and how, you know, like this move toward cash crops. I don't know, it's Wangari Maathai who described how even the religion that we had was not abstract. We had no concept of God outside of nature. That was a jump that came later with a more symbolizing of God. If you look at all the sacred sites where people used to pray, it was around trees and rivers and facing the mountain. This was the face of God when you wanted to interact. But you know, like what I was talking about, the missionary project, they saw this as idol worship. And so an early project was cut these trees and construct a church, point everybody's face toward a symbol. So the image of the God which you strove to emulate was replaced with a symbol. So you could just place a symbol. Doesn't matter whether you're massacring everything that's around you. We have this symbol.
The pre-Christian religions in Europe, of course, what they call pagan, were exactly that. You know, the gods of the winds and the mountains and the rivers and the seasons, and your food supplies depended on those cycles and flows. Something changed, and that was definitely a component part of what I fear about the human species being so naturally programmed to destroy our environment. I mean, rewind even further. Coming out of the savannas 100,000 years ago, or however long it was, when we discovered fire. What does fire do? It destroys.
It destroys, yes.
It turns naturally growing things into carbon dioxide and water vapor. So even as we develop ourselves, we have sown the seeds of destruction. It goes that far back. But of course, it was only when we started to extract fossil fuels, oil and coal, and more recently gas, that whole thing has exploded.
I see things slightly differently. I don't think that you know, this destructive impulse is so inherent. It's in certain parts of the world. You could talk about 10,000 years. There are still people. A shrinking segment of the human family, of course, people who still live in an Aboriginal lifestyle in a perfect equilibrium with the environment, but there's a lot of pressure on them. You can see as in Brazil. In terms of even our own, as Kenya, our own contribution to CO2 emissions, this is quite recent that we became agents of climate change to such an extent. We had a much more comfortable equilibrium with the environment. Even our consumption of beef was quite low. People didn't kill their cows carelessly.
But you know what the difference is?
A cow was your ability to get married. You had to take care.
The only difference is the massive explosion in population growth.
Yes, of course.
You can't sustain a huge, rapidly growing population in the same kind of subsistence farming. And I suspect that's the problem globally. There are people who are saying with 7 coming on to 8 billion people on the planet, that may be somewhere between 5 and 10 times more than is truly sustainable. Yes, you can feed everybody, you may be able to house everybody, but you can't live in that traditional way that did appear to be sustainable for hundreds of thousands of years. So what is not sustainable, as we've now discovered with the science of global warming, is the consumer lifestyle that industrialization has permitted. And something has to change. And I still want to provoke you more about how do we unlearn that?
Well, my book looks at it in terms of moving through 3 layers of our humanity. The first being just becoming comfortable in our bodies, because that's where all our addictions are rooted. There's a desperate struggle between what you could call, there's so many ways that this is characterized. Like if it was in Hinduism, they talk about Shiva and Shakti. It's basically the tension between our expectations of ourselves and then what we actually do. The classic case being somebody who intends to wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock. They set the intention, they set the alarm, but when 6 o'clock comes, they slap the alarm clock to the floor. So there's this struggle going on between us, and you see this in the case of addiction, of course. I'm not going to smoke any cigarettes today. You have people, and now you see this on a global scale where I'm sure you experience this in your work, where you have clients who express an intention. Yes, this is a really urgent thing. We need to make this change, but there's just a lethal momentum to our addiction and to our habits that make it exceedingly difficult.
So what I'm getting right now, and I absolutely see the same from our climate adaptation perspective, is that you can recognize the problem. You can even trace where it came from, but dropping off the precipice and saying, what does life look like over the edge is not something that we're clear about yet. And I think that's what you're saying, but it's certainly what I'm saying.
And we probably wouldn't have the satisfaction of an answer. One of the things that we have to accept in doing this work is that there won't be any pop of a champagne bottle and you get a pin, a reward on your chest, and
not at all, no.
Because mostly, as I talk about in unlearning, the first layer being the body, the second layer being our emotional relationships, our political relationships, how we relate to each other as human beings, and the fourth layer, of course, the third layer being our belief systems, the network of ideas and culture that undergirds,
But you package the whole thing in your book as a very nice, admirable style, one that I wouldn't be able to do, but creativity just squeals through there. And both in the way you present it, but also in the way you think about it. And I think creativity is something that we value, both of us value.
It's the celebration of uncertainty. We have to find a way to celebrate this uncertainty, because the thing I like to tell people is that if you knew, what sport do you like?
Formula One.
Formula One?
With electric cars, with sails.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, this is a bad habit.
It's going to go. That has to go.
Yeah. Okay. Let's work with Formula One. We have Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, going head to head. If you knew the outcome of this race, it wouldn't interest you. You'd stop watching. The fact that you don't know is what keeps us on the edge. And I find like we can exploit this natural instinct which we have to actually build a really fantastical world. Because if you just hit people with the, first of all, non-intuitive fact of our extinction, that it's going to happen, we're going to sink Bangladesh, no more beach, no nothing. People will just be like, okay, why not end the whole thing already? I try to make it, try to see ways that we could reorganize ourselves, that it's not seen as a trade-off. It's actually seen as a much more exciting and fulfilling life. And I look at this journey both by looking at an individual's life, like how we move from, my own journey, as well as being trained to be a lawyer, accountant, very straight, necktie, bottom line, profit maximization perspective, to shifting to this other more creative life, which is an explosion of possibility, which is exactly what we need. We have to find a way to, because if you look at what has happened from a really macro scale, if you were an alien who came down to planet Earth, what we'd see is that this group of primates here have imaginations. And imaginations on their own are quite harmless. If we were like 20,000 years ago, our imaginations didn't really have much impact on the environment, plus we were quite few. But then imagination powered with exponential technology can be extremely destructive. So the lever which I try to pull on is this imagination. How do you make this imagination much more life affirming, we can still have this explosion of imagination, but not in the form of combustion engines, in the form of electric, tours to Mars.
I deliberately called my climate change book The End of the World as We Know It, because I don't believe it is the end of the world, and I don't believe it's the end of the human species, and certainly not of humanity as we know it, in terms of all those levels that you've described. But if it's not going to be end of the world as we know it deliberately, it will anyway.
Yes.
So we have a wonderful opportunity, first and last time in the whole of human history, to consciously live up to our potential and do things differently. And like I said earlier on, we may not be able to see over the precipice, but we can create what's on the other side, using the creativity, but forgetting, unlearning what's behind, and taking a leap, literally a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And there are beginning to be movements around the world that do just that. So for example, yes, it's springing up, not expecting governments who've created the problem, nor corporations who created the problem to solve it, but rather the collective creativity of human beings wherever we find ourselves. So for example, one of the things I've said in the book, particularly aimed at the business community, and let's face it, it was industrialization through business that really triggered the global warming that's been taking place, is we need a new set of values to drive whatever new lifestyle we have. And in the business world, that means changing the way we define success away from possessions, assets, and profits, to experiences and relationships. And so whether you're talking as an individual or as a business, that is a complete flip on the head, 180 degree shift. Companies Acts, for example, make it legally obligatory on directors to take the shareholders' interest first and to make profits for them. Profit should be the result of doing things smart, not the primary focus.
And it could be considerably more profits if it's supported by technology that is abundant, like sun is
But if
abundant.
you don't take care of the planet and don't take care of your people, there will be no profits. There's no point having the profits if that's the case. So that's just one of the examples that I say that is a fundamental value set.
And I think you can already, especially with young people, you can already see traces of this shift in that a lot of young people who I know are much more concerned with access rather than ownership. So if I have access to a car when I need it, I don't mind. I'd be happy to share with someone else who's going in the same direction.
Exactly.
But also, it's also a shift in. It's a really strong shift in our mindset, especially in a place like Kenya, where a car was not just a means of transportation; it was also a status symbol. It was a way of saying I've arrived. The politicians,
So another question, and I should keep provoking this unlearning concept until we get a solid answer. How do you unlearn status symbols?
How do you unlearn status symbols?
Why do people need status symbols? Because of some kind of insecurity? Because of proving something?
I'm a bit more generous with people in this respect. There is definitely a bit of that, but if you look back just at our recent history and even our current history, when we go to the issue of human rights and the value which people have in their country, in order to access human rights, it's very closely correlated to your class. Whether you're perceived to be a person of means or not, and you can see this. You don't have to go far to see that. To see what we invest in, what we consider to be our priorities, how we spend our national wealth on, just a tiny group of individuals. No, probably less than 5,000 of them. All our national wealth is pumped into padding their lifestyle, trains and that type of thing. There is no the human being, and I'm not saying this because it has been articulated loudly. Of course, we say all the right things, but if you follow how we invest our money, we don't value human beings. That we say we have human rights, but the people who, in order to have access to human rights, it's only wealthy people who have access to those human rights.
So let's explore that a little bit, if I may.
Let me finish the loop. Let me finish the loop, and then I'll come around to this. In many parts of Africa, for example, there was apartheid, including this city. People had to walk around with these things around their neck, like a goat thing, the boogie, that would make a sound. And if you were in the wrong place, so it came from. I see a lot of the dehumanization meant that people didn't in order to demonstrate that you are valuable, you have to make this ostentatious signs of, and we created this really predatory elite which we live with. And maybe so much emphasis on politics that you see the reason why, this is me speculating, I don't claim any answers. The reason why you see so much emphasis on the territorial struggle between the different power centers in politics is because we are struggling to throw off this second layer of the limbic system, this limbic layer. We are struggling to, first of all, demonstrate that I am here, I am valuable, I do deserve to exist as a child of the planet, and then move on to the next question.
So it may be some kind of overcompensation.
And we've been going through these cycles, and we go through this cycle every 5 years, where people do make choices, but those choices are completely overridden. Even politically, they vote for one person, it makes no difference. The other guy forces himself in. So I feel like there is that struggle going on, and that's why we are so preoccupied.
But human rights is I think a potentially distracting issue, and I think one of the characteristics of recent history is that human life is valued much more than it has been in previous eras. You don't see executions in public squares as a form of entertainment. You do see health services trying to keep people alive. It works better in some places than others, but there's an enormous effort being put into keeping alive and keeping people healthy, which has contributed to the growth in the population, fairly obviously. And I think for an organization like the United Nations to say everybody has human rights, there must be human rights, do we have a right to an amenable climate?
Yes, we do, of course.
Who's going to enforce that?
It's
a meaningless concept.
It's definitely not going to be a non-responsive state. So that's why the grassroots movement is so important.
I would argue that there's no point having rights of any sort unless they're enforceable in some intelligent way. And you can't enforce there being no drought. They can't enforce there being no rainstorm later in the day. So it's a meaningless concept. So when it comes to rights and enforcement and governments and even UN levels, we're on our own. And this is why community-driven, altruistic, individual-driven behaviors, for me, is the critical solution to the dilemma we find ourselves in.
And that would be initiatives such as Afriduka's,
for example. There are quite a few globally spontaneous upswelling of concerns. You see it these past few weeks in Extinction Rebellion is one organization that's taken to the streets in capital cities around the world in a non-violent way, trying to draw attention of governments to the fact that those self-same governments are part of the problem, and they're only paying lip service to the solution. Because there are so many vested interests aimed at retaining the status quo. So it's people like you and I, with our different ways of thinking and our ways of communicating, and community-driven groups coming together spontaneously that have the power to do things differently. Since we have to come back to how unlearning can help at even the highest levels, let alone individual levels. The UK and the countries of the European Union are making quite good progress in terms of installing renewable energy and setting targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The scary thing, and one thing that is saying, so why bother, is that the USA and countries like China, even Australia, are continuing to increase their output of greenhouse gases and increase the amount of coal that they're burning, even as the rest of the world says we've got to stop it. Now, I can't imagine a country like Saudi Arabia or Russia or China deciding unilaterally to leave their oil reserves in the ground. I can't imagine companies like Gazprom and Aramco and Shell BP or any of those voluntarily saying we are going to value all of our amazing assets down to zero for the sake of the planet. That's vested interest working against our collective best interests. How does that play into your way of thinking?
It goes back to what you were talking about yourself, that it means also accepting the failure of our institutions to act in our best interest, and realizing that the locus of change is ourselves, and using that as the place to start from, wherever you are, whatever resources.
Okay, so even on an individual level, and I like that.
Not just on an individual level, but that if we are going to reorient responsibility for this shift to us and our community, that's an individual connecting to another individual, becoming our own grassroots institution.
Right, but there are ways and means where we can readily, on an individual level, get our heads around that. For example, now in Europe, they're talking about banning airline frequent flyer programs, because it is not a thing to celebrate being a frequent flyer. It turns out it's something to be embarrassed about, as I've discovered to my cost when I was doing the research on, just one long haul flight a year attributes as much carbon dioxide emission to one passenger as driving a normal car for 12 entire months. It is on that level of a bad thing to do. No doubt there are many worse things to do. But I notice around Kenya, of course, there are so many people who characterize their existence on planet Earth with a gas-guzzling, diesel fuming four-wheel drive car. Proportionally, there's far more you see around the streets of Nairobi than you do in more developed countries. How do you wean people off that kind of status symbol?
That's a really good question. I think the best way is just to demonstrate, and that's the most powerful way. If you can demonstrate, you yourself have to be the. It's like I'll give you this story. Timothy Leary had been thrown into jail for leading a big, psychedelic revolution in the 60s, and Alan Watts visited him in jail, and he told him that the way you're running around like this, getting arrested and whatever, you are undermining the credibility of the revolution that you're trying to create, because when people see you in this way, you have to embody the sort of, if you're saying that this is transformative and that people are going to live better lives, you yourself have to embody this. You yourself have to.
Right. So a lot of the demonstrations that have been going around the world definitely were kicked off by this young Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, taking herself out of school and sitting on the Swedish Parliament steps in Stockholm saying, things have got to change, you're stuffing up my planet. Could you foresee Kenyan kids getting out and saying to people, can you please keep that car at home?
They already have. And I have participated in forums like this. I mean, you probably heard of Decolonize, what they did to stop the building of the coal plant in Lamu. And the lady who triggered it is a good friend of mine, Samia Omar. She's quite young. If you look at, the organizing of young children that Wildlife Direct has been doing, the other day I was participating in a public participation forum that they organized, and they created a handbook, a wildlife handbook, where people can know what to do when they see a wildlife crime. Because a lot of the time people will walk into a place and they see illegal logging, or they see something going on and they don't quite know what to do.
Well, let me challenge you on that one, because that's something I know something about and I have a very direct interest in.
Okay.
Not far from where we're sitting here is the Olalua forest, which already has the Chinese railway line cut through it. And Chinese crews have been in there quarrying. There are one or two institutions who've encroached into the forest. And as you've seen with the Ngong forest and the highway going through it and big roundabouts, it's eroded and eroded and eroded till there's very little forest left. Now, some of the, let me just finish there. Some of the people who've decided to start agitating about this are finding themselves under threat and being followed around in a very ostensible fashion. So there is something about society in Kenya that the vested interest, whatever they may be, feels sufficiently threatened that they in turn choose to threaten those who want to see things done differently.
And that's why we came back to the political question. That's why we came back to the human rights question. Because, yes, our lives are being threatened. And I would say, yes, you're absolutely right that we can't argue about any rights if there is no planet to sit on. But for us to have, for our voices to have any impact, we have to address the human rights question. We have to address the political question in order to be able to have enough levels on power. It's like if your car was being driven by a drunken madman who has a shotgun on his lap, you are going to die. He's going to drive you off the cliff. But the first order of business is you must, as passengers...
But isn't politics the art of winning votes? Full stop.
Isn't politics the art of winning votes?
Won't politicians do anything to stay in power? And I'm not talking about Kenya, I'm talking about worldwide. So in other words, aren't they...
How do you tie that?
So politicians, a political institution, will do anything to retain power, and in a democracy that means having 50+% of the votes.
Yeah.
So they would do
Yeah.
anything to retain power, including policies that seem to appeal to the masses. They have no reason to do otherwise because they are the vested interest for retaining the status quo. So how do you persuade them to keep the forest, to not build the highways, to not have so many four-wheel drive cars imported, to not equate progress and development with landscape destruction? Isn't there a complete disconnect there?
The critical mass that you need to push things off. The reason why you see, in my estimation, the reason why you see other parts of the world erupting a lot easier is because they'd reached that critical mass. The Extinction Rebellion, there was a lot of work and grassroots work that went on before you see that eruption. Even with candidates like Bernie Sanders, there was a lot of organizing that happened before you saw that eruption. If you want to use the metaphor of an ecology, we as change makers in this society, we are trying to nurture this grassroots movement, and it's not yet matured to a point where it's erupting and forcing policy, but you still do see it. That's why I brought up the example of Decolonize and the small forums you're seeing around wildlife. It's not yet influencing policy. Of course, the suicidal momentum is there. The forces of death are there. So you're asking me to address the question to the wrong person. You're asking me to go to my killer and start begging for mercy.
No, not at all. Well, quite the reverse.
So that's why I took a long pause there, because I was trying to understand what action was being asked of me in a direct way. Because, okay, we've already identified that this is the assassin. This is a person who is organizing our extinction. So are we to try and change their mind? Do we have enough time for us to sit together and have a therapy session where what are your problems? Or do we organize? How do we get past this homicidal force? Yeah. If you want to be explicit, this is a homicidal force. They are organizing our extinction. We are losing the Mao forest, to say nothing of all the wildlife that's being destroyed. Yeah. So I, as a person who is in the receiving end, I as a citizen, who I have two choices. Either I start organizing to become a refugee, and you know what the fate of Africans has been, sinking in the Mediterranean. That's option A. Or I sit and I wrestle this mad driver who is driving me off the cliff. So those are the choices.
There's a third way. There's a third way.
What's the third option?
And I hope this is compatible with unlearning.
Okay.
The third way is doing things completely differently. And I think our conversation has demonstrated how hard it is for any of us to do that.
But you see, there's a disconnect between the individual choices, which I can make to not emit so much, not do frequent flyer.
But that's not a disconnect now.
Versus the sort of institutionalized and industrial
let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Consumer society is driven by consumers, not by producers. That's why it's called a consumer society. So if, for example, and I know this is a fantasy, we stop buying TVs and washing machines, the manufacturers would have no reason to produce them and ship them around the world for us to stock in big supermarkets. So isn't there an argument, regardless of politics and democracy, that this industrial consumer world is driven by individual choices, therefore can only be changed by individual choices?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I met somebody, Dominic Kahumbu, who's working on charcoal, and he explains how, because I was obviously like taking the scale, the big industrialist thing, like look how much timber they bring in from the Congo forest and that type of thing. And then he said, actually, when people make these timber products like a chair or a table, you have a chair and a table and you're going to keep it for a very long time. But if somebody moves from a rural area to a city, they could burn this entire house down over just their year of using charcoal. And that is a much more destructive. So if you could stop, number one, people moving to urban areas and then becoming consumers of charcoal at this scale, you could do a lot. So there's choices, there's changes that can be made, but I still don't want us to underemphasize the power of institutions. That's what I was coming to. And for us to be able to be mobilized against these institutions, we have to first of all be having that conversation with ourselves and with each other. So it's like the level of maturity of the revolution is not the same as, I would say it's not the same as even Somalia, where you saw the recent revolution with Jubaland. For us, we're at the stage of needing to have that conversation. First of all, that yes, why do we need these status symbols? Why do we need to demonstrate our humanity by sweet Jesus, English came with a ship, ostentatious, conspicuous consumption? Why do we feel?
But tackling institutions again is a potentially a consumer-driven. Let's start calling it post-consumer, wishful thinking, mass movement opportunity. For example, the Extinction Rebellion people that have taken to the streets in London these past couple of weeks as we speak, have been targeting institutions. So, for example, trying to bring to a standstill the financial centre of parts of London, trying to bring to a standstill an airport which is primarily a business flyers airport, to make the point that these institutions are contributing to the problem, and therefore central government needs to listen and do something about it. My argument being, and I think I'm reflecting their argument, which they've very carefully researched, is that those institutions are serving a constituency. And if the members of that constituency are now emerging to decide they want something else delivered to them in terms of services and functions, those institutions can only change.
Yeah, we definitely do have voting power beyond the ballot. We can also vote with how we use our money.
That's my argument.
In terms of the type of businesses that we spend our money on, spending more local. And for me, that ties into a cultural shift as well, because I feel myself as being most effective as a cultural agent. That what that looks like is taking a lot more pride in the stuff that's made next door versus
Very much so.
why do you need to wear a T-shirt that's come from all around the world? Why don't you make something locally?
I was shopping in one of the new branded supermarkets around the corner from here the other day, proudly stocked with South African goods.
Which one?
Let's not name names. I don't want to advertise them.
Yeah.
But why do you need to ship canned tomatoes from South Africa or Italy or anywhere else? When right here there are producers of both cans and tomatoes.
We have Afridukas.
And exactly so. So isn't there the beginnings of a solution to, it can get very scary to talk about the big picture. But there's the beginnings of a solution, even in what we're talking about here.
I see it like you're probably going to be much more successful in channeling our consumptive behavior into a more wholesome,
and there are business opportunities
wholesome
there.
way of doing that, rather than that would happen a lot quicker than turning around.
See, I'm finding when I talk to the business community, because I've worked for a long time as a business consultant and advisor, as well as being a writer and researcher, and I'm finding a very ready acceptance that yes, we really are facing serious problems, and then blanking it out because nobody has the faintest idea what to do about it. So if I'm talking to a business on a strategic level, I would have to say there is an existential threat. What was that about English? An existential threat to you as a business. But there are equally exciting opportunities to the threats on the other side of the equation. And producing local and channeling things in a different way is just one of them. I mean, just as the internet disappeared a whole load of industries but brought a whole load of new ones.
It dematerialized it.
The post-climate adaptation movement is going to do the same thing, don't you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And one of the things that I'm most encouraged by when I look at history and when I look at our very unlikely journey, we are at our best when we are really pushed to the brink. It's
Absolutely
a time,
right. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and it's a time, it can be very challenging, can be very scary, but especially as a parent of a young one, one thing I always try to guard against is by, panicking. Even if all is lost, I wouldn't confess that to my child. I would, make sure that spirits are high, because our creativity is directly correlated to how open we are to using.
Intriguingly, in the very first pages of your book, you talk about how creativity and childhood are intimately related.
Yeah.
Isn't that also part of our solution?
Going into this dark night, what would you rather have? Would you rather be in the company of a panicked
would you rather
or
have people in my generation solving the problem who've created it and enjoyed the fruits, or would you rather have people like your young child and that post-millennial generation? I think that the future of the planet, obviously, is in the hands of the younger generation.
Yeah.
And what I see on the streets, but also in terms of creativity, is younger people are not the lost cause that some people thought they might be. And quite the reverse. They are the groundswell of a new movement entirely.
And for us in Kenya in particular, who I feel like it all comes back to culture for me.
Yeah.
We have to become much more confident in our perspective, because I feel that respect is a very good thing, but obedience is not necessarily a good thing, especially when our parents are making irresponsible decisions. Yeah. And I feel that our fetishization, our obsession with obedience, that we must honor thy father and mother.
You see, when I grew up in the UK in the 60s, you talked about Timothy Leary, that was that era where challenging the status quo and being different was the trendy thing to do. Am I right in thinking that Kenyan society has reached that tipping point where it is now okay to challenge the status quo, or not yet?
I think our rebellion, and I was a teenager just a few years ago, I can remember it still clearly. Our rebellion is very superficial. And even the way we rebel is very conformist. For example, if you all, climb out of the house in the middle of the night while your parents are sleeping and rush to Westlands to riot and become, stupid drunk, and that's not really rebelling, because 90% of the other teenagers are doing that. You're actually conforming. You're actually a really good example of conformity. The real rebel is the one who is like Greta, for example.
Yes.
And I also try to, whenever I speak to young people, make them realize that you're actually not rebelling. If you really want to be the rebel, think differently. Do something. Say, have an existence 20 years from now. And I feel like that's the type of rebellion which I would be much more excited to see.
So back to unlearning. I'm not sure I've pinned you completely down to how we do this.
The reason why you won't, and the reason why this is an unending journey, is because all of us are in this process of discovering. Like, just the process of reading your book last night, I learned so many things. And even just in this conversation, you've seen like how a few years ago you'd be racking up the frequent flyer miles. It's a process that never comes to an end. We will not have the satisfaction of a big bang conclusion that this is our prize of change.
That's correct.
So unlearning, I just direct that these are the things that you want to look at. You want to be conscious of where you are in space-time, what my body is doing. Forget all this abstraction of looking at symbols and belief systems. See what's going on, see what's about you. Be aware of your relationships with your fellow human beings, and there are many great traditions which talk about the Hammurabic rule, the golden rule. Most religions show this, that do for others as you'd have yourself done, and just have an orientation, have a worldview that is open to transformation.
So just bringing you full circle, right at the beginning of our conversation, you touched on the issues of religion as a, if I got it right, as a colonial export along with industrialization.
Yes.
So am I getting you right that you see our increasing humanistic enlightenment, meaning that we move on from both industrialization and religious conditioning?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a great project of our time.
Isn't it just?
I'm encouraged by the words of, I don't know exactly who said it, but they said that worry is preposterous. You don't know enough to be worried. There are so many converging factors, technological, political, social, the way things will play out, the expectations of the generation that's rising, that they will interact in ways that we cannot even imagine right now. So the best posture to have is one of smiling at uncertainty and hoping that Gaia does not.
It's an exciting time to be living in all honesty, it is.
Yeah.
But I'm going to leave you with some practical tips
Okay.
that came out of my research, because what I find is that people are intimidated by the apparent global threat, the real reality of the global threat. But equally, they're hungry for simple, practical advice. What can I do that's differently? You can turn the lights off. You can stop producing fuel. You can stop burning fuel. You can leave your rubbish unburned rather than turn it into smoke. You can have a smaller car and drive it less. There are loads of things. But in the book, I summarized it, I hope, fairly neatly into a couple of very simple, straightforward things that said, buy less, burn less, waste less. Buy less.
Burn less.
Be a consumer of fewer things. Burn less,
Yes.
which means don't turn wood and paper into greenhouse
CO2.
gases.
Yeah.
And waste less,
Yes.
meaning, this is self-explanatory, isn't it? Just don't throw things away. Rather than that, just use them.
Yeah. For me, I think the page which I'd use to reflect back what you've just shared with me is this image, that in order to look at what got us here, which is a smoke belching civilization, we have to look at the process that got us there. How the waste that we do is not only just a waste of our resources outside, it's also a waste of our humanity, the way we look at human beings and the very limited conception we have of ourselves, that we are being called on, even by technological unemployment, we are being called on to see ourselves as more. And let's raise each other differently.
This is really interesting.
And do it with education.
As the industrial behemoth emerged, education systems were devised to create workers for the factories and for the administrations.
Yes.
And there was no role for creativity and problem solving in that.
Yeah, not at all. And one of the blessings of this technological revolution has been to demonstrate to us that in order to have what we really worship, our religion of neoliberalism, industrial, what do you call it, economic growth, you can achieve economic growth without human labor. We are getting to the point where you could do it with machines. So humans' role as economic agent, the more that gets moved out of the line, we can either just look at us as an extra thing to be wasted, and we have this growth for I don't know what.
Don't get me onto economics and growth. It's not my thing. I think we have to say, Asante Sana, Chief, thank you very much. Leave growth for another time.
Oh, wonderful.
Excellent. I want us to have that debate. We need to have that debate.
Not now, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Oh,
It was good. It was good.